Hello and welcome to the final day, the 12th day of the PlanesTV 12 Days of Christmas. Each day we've been live premiering a programme from our back catalogue of aviation action airshow programmes. I've selected some of my favourites and this is certainly one of those. The Russian Air Force's 100th anniversary airshow at Zhukovsky. Not an event I got to go to. I had a commitment in the UK, watching Blur in Hyde Park I think, seem to remember. But this one, my old man and Ben headed out to Russia to cover a truly remarkable show. Awesome participation from Russian Air Force, of course, but also some historic aircraft brought over to represent types that the Air Force operated, and it is those aircraft and the frontline types that this programme focuses on. We also produced the European Air Shows programme that year, which brought together some of the foreign participation in the air show. So this then all Russian types or aircraft operated by the Russian Air Force over its 100-year history at that point. I won't go into detail about what those are, you'll see the list in the description, but hopefully it's an enjoyable one to end on. And we're getting close to the Russian celebration of Christmas as well. I thought that would be a nice way to end our 12 days of Christmas with a look back to 2012 and the Russian Air Force 100th anniversary air show. I hope you enjoy.
This is Zhukovsky, a town massively expanded after World War II to become the centre of Russian aircraft design, test and manufacture. It is the home of the now famous biannual MAX show, and PlanesTV is making its first visit here. The dispersals surrounding the 3-mile-long runway are littered with magnificent technology of its time, some successful, some not. It's not preservation in the public access sense, but all are thankfully defying the scrapman's torch and are testament to important aeronautical innovation. Some of the more historic airframes are approachable. The Buran space shuttle is a case in point and will hopefully become a renovated visitor attraction. This August weekend is a national holiday commemorating August the 12th, 1912, when an air division was formed within the Russian Army's General Staff. In this programme, we concentrate on the Russian aircraft types on display and historic aircraft with an important Russian connection. We are making a parallel programme called European Air Shows, which covers the international visitors in much more depth. Day 1, Friday, was a rehearsal day with privileged entry for a big crowd. Day 2, Saturday, was VIP day, with heavy security relaxed somewhat after President Putin had left, and Day 3, Sunday, was shoulder to shoulder for a massive crowd. In all, the event welcomed 300,000 enthusiastic people, many from outside Russia, and Air Force commanders from over 80 countries. The organisation on airshow days was exemplary, with everyone being brought in by a fleet of 180 buses. PlanesTV cameras attended on all 3 days, recording from crowdside and airside on the opposite side of the runway. Our programme generally follows the sequence on airshow days and sometimes repeats set pieces and movements as viewed from the airside camera. Here is a 60-second cavalcade of the action coming up. The arrival of 3 Mi-8 helicopters signified the arrival of President Putin. Soundtrack 2 on this DVD has no narration, but the powerful event public address system is ever present on the crowd-side camera material and generally clean location sound from the airside cameras. With rotors stopped, cue the first item that had been patiently loitering at something like 10,000 feet, a LET 410 with parachutists linking together in freefall. 3 of the parachutists released huge 27 by 18 metre flags befitting this important occasion. This is the flag of the Russian Defence Ministry, led by the flag of the Russian Federation. The third flag is that of the Russian Air Force. In the 100 years since the Air Force was established in the reign of Tsar Nicholas II, there has been tremendous growth in the power and influence of Russia, accompanied by considerable political changes. 1919 saw the monarchy overthrown, followed by 70 years of communism, during which time international allegiances shifted. Most notably, Soviet Russia was allied to the powers fighting Nazi Germany in what was to become known as the Great Patriotic War. She suffered huge losses beyond contemplation by most in the West. The stalemate of the Cold War saw a big military build-up when the former Allies became potential adversaries, with secrecy and the power of growing nuclear arsenals feeding fear and animosity. Both sides realised the danger and futility of this ever-growing and expensive technology and arms race. The strategic arms limitation talks were soon followed by the collapse of communism and replacement by glasnost and perestroika, or friendship and reconstruction. A direct effect was a considerable reduction in military aviation development. President Putin, in his address to the Russian people from the air show, thanked all of those who have been loyal to their jobs and traditions in the years when the planes were grounded, and promised $720 billion programme to deliver 600 new combat planes and 1,000 helicopters by 2020, all afforded by a recent boom in oil revenues. The show proper began with historic aircraft types. The European delegation had been invited by the Russian government and managed by the well-known historic aircraft collector and restorer Boris Osiatinsky. Representing the earliest days of Russian aviation is this Tulin-A Blériot. It was rebuilt with an original 1908 7-cylinder Gnome Omega 50 horsepower rotary engine by Michael Carlson from Sweden. He is also flying it today. Pioneer Russian scientists such as Nikolai Kibalchich and Alexander Moyesky began theoretical projects in the 1880s, and Konstantin Zhukovsky did further work in the 1890s. In 1904, Nikolai Zhukovsky established the world's first aerodynamic institute in Kashino near Moscow. In 1910, the Imperial Army purchased a number of French planes and began training the first military pilots. The poet Vasily Kamensky was another founding father of Russian aviation. He learned to fly a Blériot 11 like this one in France and flew widely in Russia, bringing the word samolyot or airplane into circulation. On August 12, 1912, the special body of military control of aviation and aeronautics was established in the Russian armed forces. In 1992, this day was officially designated in the Russian Federation as the Day of the Air Force. Kamensky, however, had given up flying by now after a crash in 1911. Flying these flimsy, unreliable and difficult airframes was indeed a dangerous art. Even today, it takes immense skill to fly this Blériot with its wing warping control and unresponsive engine. This French Nieuport in the static display is similar to many used by Russia against Germany in World War I. In the flying display, we see two other aircraft belonging to Michael Carlson. The Tummelisa, or Tom Thumb, was designed and built in Sweden as a trainer just after World War I, but this German fighter, the Fokker DR-1 triplane, was a feared adversary. By the beginning of World War I, Russia had an air force second only to France, with 263 aircraft in 39 detachments, but only for reconnaissance and coordination of artillery fire. By December, aerial defence of the capital of Russia, Petrograd and its environs, had been created, and so had a squadron of Ilya Muromets bombers for use against the German and Austro-Hungarian armies. Their designer, Igor Zhukovsky, became an aviation legend, but not in Russia. This aerial demonstration is reminiscent of the deadly air battles between Russian and German pilots. Among those were the legendary Peter Nesterov, who performed the first aerial ramming plane attack in the history of aviation, and the most successful Russian flying ace and fighter pilot, Alexander Kazakov, who shot down 32 enemy planes. It has to be said that the war did not go well for Russia, and following significant setbacks on the Eastern Front and the economic collapse in the rear, military aircraft production fell far behind Russia's rival, Germany. In late 1916, Igor Zhukovsky built a unique four-engined bomber biplane called Alexander Nevsky, but it was never put into serial production due to the events preceding and following the 1917 October Revolution and Zhukovsky's emigration to the United States of America in 1919. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Imperial Russian Air Force was succeeded by the Workers' and Peasants' Air Fleet with the status of a main directorate on May the 24th, 1918. By the end of World War I, it had become an independent arm of the land force. Next on show is the Polikarpov P-02. As in most countries, 2 decades after the start of World War I, aviation technology had hardly advanced, with low-powered fabric and string biplanes still predominating. Organisationally, the Air Force acquired the status of an independent arm in 1932, 4 years after this Polikarpov P-02 entered service, although it was known as the U-2 until 1944. It replaced the U-1, an Avro 504 variant in the training role, but was also used for ground attack, reconnaissance, medevac and liaison. It was an extremely successful aircraft, but there are no accurate figures on how many were actually built. It was certainly over 20,000, and with production taking place in all manner of dispersed workshops from huge quantities of spare parts, there may have been as many as 40,000 built. The official production line in Russia ended in 1952, but continued under licence in Poland until 1959, making it the most produced biplane in history. Its operational success in the Great Patriotic War included psychological warfare. Surprise night attacks on German troops, often gliding for the final attack, added to the stress serving on the Eastern Front. The female pilots, known as the Night Witches of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, had a particularly demoralising effect and earned numerous Hero of the Soviet Union citations. Many of the surviving pilots had flown nearly 1,000 combat missions by the end of the war. Even in the Korean War, it was successful in the same role, attacking and destroying F-86 and F-51 aircraft on the ground. Despite widespread deployment of radar, the fabric and wood construction of the PO-2 made it almost invisible. Praise of sorts, it was in the Soviet Air Force ranks long enough into the Cold War to merit a NATO codename: Mule. The aircraft Mark 65 is owned by Alexandra Krylev, a recent World Advanced Aerobatic Champion. A family of Polikarpov biplane fighters, variously designated the I-15, I-152 and I-153, grew up from the I-14 of 1932 and was dogged by a series of backwards and forwards design changes. The official name, I-15, became I-15 bis after development, bis meaning second, but it is generally referred to as the I-152. It is one of those we see here. The I-153 was a further development with retractable undercarriage. Soviet fighter tactics in the 1930s called for a fast monoplane fighter to break up enemy formations and a manoeuvrable biplane to pick out the now scattered individuals. In practice, this proved to be a flawed plan. From a design point of view, this meant that Polikarpov abandoned the retractable undercarriage and enclosed cockpit of the I-14 and developed the gull upper-winged I-15, known as the Chaika, which translates as seagull. It went into production in 1934. The redesigned I-15 bis that we see here proved heavier and less manoeuvrable and failed its acceptance trials, but despite this was still ordered into production. In 1937, 4 volunteer squadrons equipped with the original gull-wing I-15 were sent to help China after the Japanese invasion. They were superior to the Japanese biplanes used at the time and held their own against the new A5M2 monoplanes, the forerunner of the famous Zero. This is the Polikarpov I-152 DIT two-seat trainer. The original I-15 also proved successful in combat in the Spanish Civil War, where it became known as Chato or Snubnose. Large numbers were flown initially by Soviet pilots with fake Spanish names. Later, they trained many volunteers of various nationalities, including several Americans. They flew monoplane I-16s, but both were increasingly outclassed by new enemy monoplanes like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Fiat G50. Indeed, even the obsolescent Fiat CR-32 biplane fared well in dogfights with the monoplane I-16. The latter's tactics did not take advantage of the type's higher speed. This led to a flawed decision to develop the I-153 version with retractable undercarriage rather than concentrate on monoplane fighters that would soon dominate aerial combat. The I-153 had a brief success against the Japanese in Mongolia in 1939, but when Hitler eventually attacked Russia in June 1941, I-152 and 153 biplanes still dominated the Russian Air Force. Most were destroyed in the first few days of the war, but the survivors had to remain in frontline service until more modern types could replace them. Their latter role was ground attack and night bombing. We begin a series of displays by aircraft supplied to Russia by the USA and United Kingdom under the Lend-Lease scheme. We start with the Catalina because it had a much earlier association with Russia. In 1937, the Soviet government bought Consolidated's first commercial PBY second-hand for $230,000, more than twice the brand-new price, to search for Sigismund Lievinesky and his crew who disappeared during a flight across the North Pole. Sadly, they were never found, but the aircraft flew 19,000 miles in bad weather over difficult terrain, heavily loaded with fuel and supplies, and impressed the Soviet government. It was converted for military use, and the government got its money's worth through a distinguished service that ultimately included the search for survivors of the convoy PQ-17, before it was shelled and destroyed by a U-boat whilst at anchor. Back to 1937, 3 more examples were bought and assembled in Russia, and a contract entered into for licensed production. Designated GST, only 27 were built due to the difficulty of production, low priority, and the fact the factory was overrun by the Germans. 185 were delivered under the Lend-Lease scheme, 48 of which were the ultimate amphibious PBY-6A model, and the early ones were, strictly speaking, PBN Nomads because they were built by the Naval Air Factory to a new design rather than alongside the consolidated PBYs. The Catalina was the most successful flying boat of the war by far, mainly thanks to its huge range. The entire wing was effectively a fuel tank. It was used for maritime patrol, rescue, and made a number of successful anti-submarine attacks. Russia also used it to deploy agents and special forces troops, most notably to help establish new communist regimes towards the end of the war. Many were re-engined and used well into the 1950s. There are rumours that 1 or 2 still exist. This particular Catalina is from Duxford and operated by Plain Sailing. The first Lend-Lease type to arrive in quantity was the British Hawker Hurricane in July 1941, less than 1 year after the Battle of Britain, where Hurricanes had shot down more enemy aircraft than all other types put together. The reason that Russia needed these modern aircraft was partly because so many of their own aircraft had been destroyed in the German assault of June 1941, but also because of their lack of preparedness for war. Stalin's purges of the 1930s had seen large numbers of military commanders executed, so the potential leaders were just not there to assess and manage the necessary defence strategy. What the Air Force lacked in leadership, equipment and training, they made up for in weight of numbers, dedication and sheer heroism. Lend-Lease gave them the time to repurpose their own powerful industries. Almost 3,000 Hurricanes were sent to Russia as part of the Lend-Lease agreement. They were popular with pilots because they were simple to control and easy to maintain and repair. Also, all Hurricanes were fitted with radios, unlike Russian aircraft. However, technology moves on rapidly in wartime, and they were soon outdated as fighters and so overhauled and retasked for ground attack. Britain also sent over 1,300 Spitfires. This Hurricane has made the long flight here from Duxford in the UK. It is owned and operated by the Historic Aircraft Collection and flown by David Harvey. It is a pity that the show was not able to muster a P-39 Airacobra, the most successful of all Lend-Lease types, so the P-40 will have to fill in. Around 2,400 of various marks were delivered, both models B and C called Tomahawks, and later models the Kitty Hawk. Soviet pilots found it a match for the German 109, and it was good at low level too, able to take a lot of battle damage. But as with other Western types, it was not up to the Russian winter, and there were problems with batteries, tyres, coolant, oil and hydraulics, all made worse by the lack of Russian language maintenance manuals. The Russians became adept at modifications and workarounds. A typical situation would be when cracked radiators had to be repaired, then silver cutlery to melt down would be confiscated from nearby villages. With the P-39, the Russian pilots were able to teach the Americans effective modifications and use. This Kitty Hawk is a P-40N built in 1942 and flies in her original colours of the 7th Fighter Squadron. It is owned by the French Amical Jean-Baptiste Salis Association and flown here by Bob Villanova. The P-51 Mustang was one of the most successful fighters of World War II, but only just qualifies for inclusion here. Only 10 examples were delivered to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. These were Mark 1s from the RAF. They were tested, but the Russians found they underperformed compared to contemporary Soviet fighters, so relegating them to training units. As the P-51 was developed, it became ideal for long-range escort of bomber formations, but this was a role that was never needed on the Eastern Front. Nonetheless, the P-51 was a regular visitor to the Soviet Union from June 1944 on the famous shuttle missions. It escorted huge numbers of B-17 bombers, landing after their missions in the Ukraine for refuelling and rearming for another mission on the return leg. P-51s abandoned in the operations were subsequently repaired and returned to service in Russia. There is some evidence of their use against Finland, but as with the earlier deliveries, they were mainly used in support roles. This is another aircraft owned by the French Amical Jean-Baptiste Salis Association and flown here by Captain George Perez. The original aircraft that this one depicts, that of top ace Major Leonard Kit Carson of the 357th Fighter Group out of Leiston Airfield in the UK, may well have taken part in the shuttle missions. Another aircraft used extensively in the West but only supplied in limited numbers to the USSR was the North American AT-6 Texan. Just 82 of these advanced trainers assisted in the massive job of training the hundreds of thousands of aircrew. In truth, the Soviet Air Force did not need a trainer aircraft from the West. They had capacity to make large numbers of simple aircraft, plus enough obsolete types to do their own job. The North American Aviation T-6 Texan was a single-engine advanced trainer aircraft used to train pilots of the United States Army Air Forces, United States Navy, Royal Air Force and other air forces of the British Commonwealth during World War II and into the 1950s. The T-6 is known by a variety of designations depending on the model and operating air force. The US Army Air Corps designated it the AT-6, the US Navy, the SNJ, and British Commonwealth Air Forces, the Harvard, the name it is best known by outside of the United States. It remains a popular warbird aircraft. This particular example is based in Sweden and was built by Nordun in Canada. Another aircraft built by North American, and this time a Soviet pilot's favourite. The B-25 Mitchell bomber was a cruise delight right down to the survival pack that included a fishing rod and bait. The maintenance manuals were in indecipherable English, but the humorous cartoon-style drawings were a hit with the Soviet engineers. They were among the first Lend-Lease aircraft to arrive, seeing action from Stalingrad right up to the war's end. In all, 862 aircraft were supplied, supplemented by several operated by Allies and forced to land in Russia. Indeed, one such was a survivor of the famous Doolittle raid on Tokyo, having taken off from an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. In conjunction with the similarly configured and more numerous A-20 Havoc, they were used for ground support and tactical daylight bombing. This B-25J was built in 1945 in the North American Aviation plant in Kansas City and delivered to the United States Army Air Force. Struck off charge in 1957 and initially stored in the Arizona desert, she eventually returned to flight as a crop duster. A succession of owners continued the restoration to military configuration and colours, ultimately to its near brand new condition for Red Bull in Austria. Another hugely welcomed Lend-Lease aircraft was the Douglas DC-3 Transport, or C-47 in military service. 237 were already in use in Russia as civilian airliners by the time of the Nazi invasion, following an agreement to manufacture under licence by Lisanov in 1936. Outwardly, it appeared identical to the DC-3, but there had been over 1,200 design changes, mostly to convert them from imperial to metric. The The original civilian airliner was designated PS-84 and the subsequent military version the Li-2. As many as 6,000 had been built when production ended in 1950. The original plant was overrun by the Nazis at the start of the war, so Lend-Lease aircraft filled an important gap until the new Tashkent factory was ready. A total of 707 of various C-47 and Dakota Marks 1 to 4 were delivered. Another big difference between the C-47 and the Li-2 was that the latter was armed with machine guns and some versions had bomb racks and a dorsal gun turret. Smaller bombs were carried inside the fuselage and thrown out of the freight hatch by the crew. They served long enough into the Cold War to earn the NATO codename CAB. With so many DC-3s and C-47s still flying around the world, it is a real sadness that only one Li-2 is known to survive in flying condition. To represent the Soviet Li-2, Sweden sent the C-47B Skytrain. An interesting anecdote around the Lend-Lease story is the unofficial way that Western civilians would stuff all manner of gifts, food cans, warm clothing, into every free space. Female ferry pilots even left cosmetics and stockings. In 1938, it was decided that a fast, high-altitude interceptor was needed. The MiG-1 first flew in March 1940, but was an aerodynamic nightmare, caused partly by the imbalance of a heavy, powerful engine and the extensive use of wood in the airframe. Only 100 were built before production switched to the vastly improved MiG-3 that we see here. Nearly 1,000 MiG-3s were in use by the start of the war, but there were less than 500 trained pilots. Although it was faster than both the Spitfire and the Bf-109 at 20,000 feet, most of the aerial fighting was at a lower level where it lost its advantage, and it was equally unsuitable for ground attack when pressed into that role in late 1941. They were, however, easy to maintain in the field and simple and economical to mass produce, but poor production quality resulted in the head of the Air Force Scientific Test Institute being executed. Improved MiG-3UD was introduced in 1941, which not only gave it increased aerodynamics, it enabled an improvement in production quality. Designer Mikhail Gurevich was awarded the State Stalin Prize for his contribution to aviation. A final version, the MiG-3U, was introduced in August 1942 with a new wooden fuselage. It was lighter weight and better armed, but a decision to prioritise the IL-2 Sturmovik saw production finish at the end of 1941, with almost 3,200 built. Despite its failings, Russians were adept at workarounds, and ace pilot Alexander Pokrushkin scored many of his 53 official victories in the MiG-3. There are 3 MiG-3s flying today, and all were rebuilt by the Russian company Avia Restoration, using the American Allison engine of the P-39, P-40 and early P-51s. The family of Yak fighters, Yak 1, 3, 7, 9 and the trainer Yak 11 here could be considered equivalent to the development of the Spitfire and Messerschmitt 109 through their various marks, although their designations are a bit confusing. This Yak 9 actually preceded the Yak 3 that we see next. Total production of the Yak fighters was 36,716, which actually beats the 35,000 Bf-109s generally considered to have been the most produced fighter ever. Unlike the MiG-1, the Yak-1 was actually an instant success. Fast, manoeuvrable, well-armed, reliable and easy to maintain. The Yak-7 that followed was simpler, tougher and better still. This Yak 9 was lighter and had an all-round vision canopy. Pilots thought it comparable or better than the Messerschmitt Bf-109G and Focke-Wulf FW-190. (16,769) were built up to 1948, making it the most mass-produced Soviet fighter of all time. It first saw combat in the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 and excelled at all of its variety of roles, from ground attack to long-range fighter escort. It was a particularly good dogfighter, so much so that instructions issued to the Luftwaffe were not to engage Yaks that did not have an oil cooling intake under the nose. This is something of a turnaround to the Nazi propaganda leaflets dropped over Moscow in 1942, goading the Russians to send something up worth fighting. The famed Free French Normandy Niemen units were equipped with Yak 9s and earned such a reputation that the Germans instructed that any French pilots captured should be executed. The unit lost 87 aircraft and 52 pilots, but shot down 273 aircraft, with numerous trains, trucks and vehicles destroyed, plus 2 E-boats. A Yak 9 was the first Soviet aircraft to shoot down a Messerschmitt 262 jet and was used by North Korea in the Korean War. The aircraft we see here is Paul Beaucham's Yak 9 N82112 from Switzerland. The last of the piston-powered fighter line was the Yak 3, and this particular model was the last of those, French-registered Yak 3 UTI in the markings of Soviet ace Ivan Kozydub. He survived the war with 62 individual aerial victories, making him the top-scoring Allied fighter pilot of World War II. Normandy Niemen pilot Marcel Albert, the official top-scoring World War II French ace, regarded the Yak 3 as a superior aircraft to the Supermarine Spitfire and P-51D Mustang. Fitting a radial engine was an attempt at increasing performance and solving the overheating problems of the inline engines. This worked, but was too late for action in World War II. However, in 2011, a modified replica Yak 3U beat the world speed record for under 3,000 kilogram piston-engined aircraft, reaching 407 miles an hour and unofficially 415 the next day. Unusually for fighters of any country, the Yak-3 was never seriously tasked with ground attack. Such was its success as an air-to-air fighter. The production line was reopened in 1991, and a number of true replica Yak-3s have been newly manufactured by Yakovlev for the warbird market, using the original plans and dies. These are powered by Allison V1710 engines and have the designation Yak-3M. The Yak-11 tandem two-seat trainer served the Soviet Air Force and air forces of 20 or so other Soviet-influenced countries up until 1962. Nearly 4,000 were built in Russia and a further 707 under licence by Let in Czechoslovakia, where it was designated the C-11. Its NATO code name was Moose, but Warsaw Pact countries called it the Hawk. Yak-11 set several speed records and were used in combat, most notably by North Korea, with one being the first North Korean aircraft shot down by US forces in 1950. East Germany used the Yak-11 to intercept unmanned reconnaissance balloons. Around 120 Yak-11s remain in airworthy condition due to its popularity among warbird and air racing enthusiasts. This is one such, operated by Capel Aviation from France. A cold look at World War II casualties explains why the Soviet Union felt it was so important to build military strength and create a geographical buffer to its homeland. Around 24 million Russians were killed, more than half of them civilians, compared to under 1 million for the UK and USA combined. And so began the Cold War and an arms race.
This live premiere is part of the PlanesTV 12 Days of Christmas. At 7 PM UK time each evening from Christmas Day through to January 5th, we're airing a full-length programme from our on-demand archive here on YouTube and on Facebook. Make sure to like the PlanesTV Facebook page and subscribe on YouTube. And if you're enjoying what you're seeing, make sure to like the video and give it a share so other people can enjoy it too. And who knows, maybe I'll do more of these in future. Also, make sure to check the description of this video to find out how you can access our on-demand archive anytime. Right now though, let's get back on with the show. I hope you enjoy.
Over 12,000 MiG-15s, NATO codename Faggot, were built in the USSR. Licensed forward production is thought to have added another 6,000, making it the most widely produced jet aircraft ever made. Its predecessor, the MiG-9, had engines based on captured German designs that were just as unreliable when in Russian jets. To Stalin's astonishment, the British Labour government agreed to supply the successful Rolls-Royce Nene engine. This was promptly reverse-engineered to make the Klimov VK-1. With swept-wing technology captured from the Germans and a powerful and reliable jet engine, the MiG-15 flew just in time to deploy in combat against UN forces in North Korea in 1950. The focus has always been on aerial duels with the F-86 Sabre, but the MiG-15's job was to attack the B-29 bombers operating with impunity, protected by advanced jets like the F-80 Shooting Star and F-84 Thunderjet. In that role, they were entirely successful, causing the cancellation of the B-29 daylight bombing missions. They were so successful too against the straight-wing jets that the F-86 Sabre was rushed to the theatre. Kill claims on both sides were exaggerated and are still being researched, but consensus seems to be that the MiG was the better aircraft, but US pilots had better tactics. The MiG-15 was just as successful against the bombers at night, and those missions were also curtailed. But it did meet its superior in the Douglas Skynight, which had an effective combination of search and fire control radar. After a long restoration, this two-seat MiG-15 UTI trainer, NATO codename Midge, flew again just 3 weeks before the show. It's flown by the distinguished test pilot Ildis Eksanovich Kiromov. The owner, Chisik Andrei Stanislavovich, intends to build up a collection of Russian and Soviet types. The MiG-15's legacy is the lineage that followed: MiG-17, 19, 21, 23, 25, 29, 31 and 35. Mikhail Mill developed his first helicopter, the Mi-1, in 1950, powered by a piston engine in common with all other first-generation helicopters. But the advent of gas turbines brought the opportunity for much more power and therefore load-carrying capability for a similar aircraft weight. The Mi-2 was basically the Mi-1 with 2 gas turbines above the cabin, thus permitting much more space for payload. It first flew in 1961 and production was transferred to PZL in Poland. Nearly 5,500 were built from 1965 to 1998, and it has been so successful that hundreds still fly today. There were 4 principal versions: passenger transport with ultimately up to 10 people, cargo including 4 patients in the medevac role, crop spraying and close air support armed with rockets, cannon and machine guns. Its NATO reporting name is Hoplite. These days, many like this one are used for training and flight experience operated by DOS-AAF, which literally is the Volunteer Society for Cooperation with the Army, Aviation and Fleet. Taking us right up to date now is the first of the displays from the present-day Russian Air Force. With over 4,000 aircraft and 170,000 personnel at 61 bases, it is the second largest air force in the world. It is currently under the command of Colonel General Alexander Zelin. Of these Sukhoi Su-35S super manoeuvrable multi-role fighters are in service, with another 48 on order. NATO designate this the Flanker E, and it is the latest in a line of successful flanker designs that were first introduced nearly 30 years ago. It was originally designated Su-37 when it first flew in this configuration in 1996, but confusingly changed to Su-35BM and then went into production as the Su-35S. Besides improvements to its aerodynamics, avionics and engines, the difference that first earned it the Su-37 name and differentiates the Su-35S from the Su-35 is the two-dimensional thrust vectoring in pitch plane, with a range of plus or minus 15 degrees, enabling it to perform manoeuvres like this. Just watch. It has substantial sustained supersonic cruise capability, which gives it an enormous energy advantage against conventional air combat fighters and carries the full spectrum of Russian air-to-air and air-to-ground guided weapons. There is a great export potential for this aircraft, and there have already been discussions with Venezuela, Brazil, India, Egypt, Malaysia, Algeria and even US-aligned Australia. China is very close to signing an agreement, but since their interest is primarily the engine, there is concern in Russia about reverse engineering. The Su-35 has considerable long-term growth potential. It is likely that it will become the platform for the first Russian-built large-aperture AESA radars, as well as the R-172 very long-range air-to-air missile. Vyazma Rus fly the Aero L-39 Albatros Advanced Trainer. They formed at the Vyazma Air Force Training Center in 1987 and have flown more than 300 displays. They became a civilian team in 2012, operating within DOSAAF. DOSAAF is a paramilitary sport organisation concerned mainly with weapons, automobiles and aviation. Its original goal was to prepare reservists for the armed forces, and the word volunteer really meant partially obligatory. It was also a fundraiser for the military. The L-39 was built in Czechoslovakia and widely sold around the Eastern Bloc and beyond. Unusually, it was never given a NATO reporting name. Of the 2,800 built, more than 2,000 were supplied to the Soviet Union, and these were passed on to successor states when the USSR broke up. Today, the L-39 is operated by both the Russian Air Force and DOS-AAF. The type has become very popular with wealthy private pilots, and more than 250 are registered in the USA. Several civilian aerobatic teams operate them too. You can actually buy a flight with Vyazma Rus. The Beerkut's aerobatic display team from the Russian Air Force have recently re-equipped with the MIL Mi-28 attack helicopter, NATO name Havoc. The team was first established in 1992 with the Mi-24 Hind, an aircraft that has a lot of commonality with the Mi-28. It was this commonality and a new all-weather capability that saved it from a 1992 decision to cancel the project, and now both it and its competitor, the Kamov Ka-50, fulfill the attack helicopter role. Around 30 are in service, with 67 due to have been delivered by 2015. It was designed to fulfill the same role as the American AH-64 Apache, but with the added capability of accommodating 3 extra people, most likely other rescued aircrew. But it does not have the troop transport capability of its predecessor. Standard armament is the 30mm chain gun in the nose barbette, clearly seen here, which, depending on the ordnance chosen, has a rate of fire of up to 550 rounds per minute and up to 2,500 metres range. In addition, a variety of unguided rockets are being upgraded to laser guiding. The pilot designates the target with his helmet-mounted display, and the navigator weapons officer fires the weapons. Each sit in their own heavily armoured cockpit with a windshield capable of withstanding heavy caliber bullets. All Mi-28s in the Beerkut team are standard surface helicopters from Torzok Air Base and do not have any special paint scheme. The first of the civilian aerobatic displays is by a DOS-AAF Sukhoi Su-31. Funds for sport aircraft have been severely limited in recent years, but the Central Aviation Club was recently able to purchase and renovate a handful of Su-26 and Su-31s. It is these aircraft that Russia's renowned international aerobatic pilots will be using for training and competition. This is a far cry from the times when no expense was spared to develop a world-beating aerobatic monoplane, and the prototype Su-26 first flew here at Zhukovsky in 1984. With modifications that saw it designated Su-26M, Soviet pilots won first place in nearly half the World Aerobatic Championship classifications in 1986. International interest and sales followed, resulting in a 2-seat trainer, the Su-29. This single-seat Su-31 we see here is outwardly almost identical to the Su-26, but in fact only shares 65% commonality. It is lighter, more powerful and more manoeuvrable, and tests the human frame to the very edge of its capability. So much so that it became the first aerobatic aircraft fitted with an ejector seat. It is even survivable flying inverted at 150 metres. More than 150 Su-26, 29 and 31s have been built, the vast majority being exported. It was the first Russian type ever to be sold to the USA. A highlight now that many have been waiting for, a formation flyby of the bombers of the Long Range Aviation Command. First to fly through is the Tupolev Tu-22 M3 Backfire, a long-range supersonic swing-ring strategic and maritime strike bomber. Around 500 are thought to still be in use. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, long-range aviation in Russia became close to dormant and formally disbanded in 1998, but deep penetration missions began again in 2007 and the command reformed in 2009. Next, the distinctive rumble of 12 Kuznetsov turboprops driving huge contra-rotating propellers, the awesome and iconic Tupolev Tu-95 MS Bear. A Tu-95 dropped the so-called Tsar bomb in 1961, the most powerful atomic weapon ever detonated. Like the American B-52, it is expected to remain in service for some time, not just as a weapons platform, but a symbol of Russian power and prestige. Last is a flight of Tupolev Tu-160 Blackjack bombers, the biggest military aircraft in the world, the biggest supersonic aircraft and the biggest swing-wing aircraft. The names of Russian heroes are prominently displayed on the nose, and the anti-flash white finish has earned them the nickname White Swan. "16 have been built and a further 14 are on order. In recent exercises with Tu-95s, several aircraft launched their entire load of 12 cruise missiles. A look now at Antonov transports, a range of contrasts, some of them world record breakers. Oleg Antonov began work on his Go Anywhere, Do Anything aircraft in 1937, but abandoned that to concentrate on the A-1 family of training gliders. After the war, the AN-2, Anushka or Annie to Russians and Colt to NATO, started on its 45-year production run. The rest, as they say, is history. The AN-26, NATO codename Curl, is a development of the successful rough field transport AN-24, but now with a cargo ramp and equipment for paratroops. The Antonov AN-140 is designed to replace the AN-24 series of aircraft, and the Russian Air Force received its first early in 2012 for VIP transport, with another 10 on order. It can carry up to 52 passengers or can be used for patrol and military transport. The Russian Air Force still uses 50s of these outstanding veteran AN-12 Cub tactical transports. It first flew in 1957 and is widely used around the world by cargo airlines and air forces. A reverse-engineered copy is still in production in China. The Antonov AN-22, NATO codename Kok or Anti in Russia, astonished Western observers with his surprise appearance at the Paris Air Show in 1965. It was the biggest aircraft in the world at the time and remains the biggest turboprop aircraft ever built. It was due for retirement, but demand for its successor, the AM-124, has resulted in a life extension for 6 of these Leviathans until 2020. The AN-124 Ruslan, NATO codename Condor, is another world-beating Antonov design. It carries 150 tons of cargo, 25% more than the US equivalent C-5 Galaxy. It has recently had a new lease of life and extended production run, such is the worldwide demand to transport outsized cargoes. It was the biggest aircraft in the world until Antonov smashed that record with a 6-engine version, the AN-225. It is a pity that we were not able to view that here. The Soviet airline Aeroflot initiated the development by Let in Czechoslovakia of a twin-engine short-range transport to replace the AN-2. The result, this L-10 Turbolet, has been a worldwide success and is still being manufactured with outstanding orders for the Russian Air Force. Nikita Khrushchev was said to be so impressed by the French Caravelle airliner that he ordered work on what was to become the successful and widely exported Tupolev Tu-134, NATO codename Krusty. 852 were built and many still survive today. The UBL and the UBK, are bomber trainer variants. The Ilyushin IL-76 is a medium-range military transport aircraft known as Candid to NATO. It entered service in 1974 and nearly 1,000 have been built. It proved especially successful during Soviet operations in Afghanistan, being able to withstand significant battle damage from heat-seeking missiles and heavy-caliber machine guns. The Ilyushin IL-80, NATO codename Maxdome, is an air command post for officials and the President in the event of nuclear war. It is based on the IL-86 wide-bodied airliner, but with no windows, fewer hatches, on complex baffling inside to protect against electromagnetic pulses. The 4 built are based at Zhukovsky near Moscow. The manufacturer Berev developed this A-50 airborne early warning and control system based on the IL-76 airframe. It is fitted with the powerful Bumblebee radar and communications set, and the upgraded A-50U variant can track up to 150 targets and control 10 to 12 fighters. Its NATO reporting name is Mainstay. The small, fast and agile single-seat Kamov Ka-50 was designed to replace the Mi-24 Hind. It became known as Werewolf as a result of the tail markings at its debut Farnborough Air Show, but officially it was called Hokum A by NATO. The breakup of the Soviet Union prevented it going into mass production and cut back the development of a night attack capability. By now Mill had developed the two-seat tandem Mi-28 design, and Kamov decided to develop a two-seat version of the Ka-50. The second crew member would operate the Optronics radar recce suite. A tandem cockpit variant was built and tested in cooperation with Israel Aerospace Industries, but Kamov ultimately settled on a homegrown side-by-side design, extolling the virtues of improved cooperation between the crew members. Thus, the Ka-52 we see here was born, Russian name Alligator and NATO code name Hokum B. Whilst the Mi-28 has become the standard attack helicopter for the Russian Air Force and Army, there are 140 Ka-52s on order for the Air Force. The Navy too has chosen the Ka-52. The argument which is the best will continue. Is the Ka-52 more stable and safer because of the contra-rotating rotors? Does the Mi-28 cockpit protect the crews better? Does side-by-side seating make for better crew cooperation? In the meantime, the single-seat Ka-50 is the mount of choice to support special forces. Time and perhaps export sales success will determine the winner.
This programme is one of nearly 300 full-length airshow programmes, live broadcasts and special features available on the PlanesTV On Demand service. Head to PlanesTV.com/12 days to get half-price access to PTV On Demand for 6 months. The service includes all programmes PlanesTV has released over the last 10 years and also very many from our early archive which stretches all the way back to 1989. That link again is PlanesTV.com/12 days. You'll even get a 7-day free trial on the service. Now though, let's get back on with the show. Enjoy.
And now for the long-awaited fighter flypast. First, the Yak 130 fighter trainer and light attack aircraft. We will see a full display shortly. The Sukhoi Su-24 Fencer is a supersonic swing-wing two-seat attack aircraft. Around 500 are still in use of the 1400 produced, mostly this M version. The revolutionary and record-breaking MiG-31 Foxhound. It was much feared in the 1980s due to its speed, ceiling and long-range look-up, look-down multi-tracking radar. With upgrades, it will remain in service for years to come. The Sukhoi Su-34 fullback we will also see later. It is a two-seat fighter bomber designed to replace the Su-24 Fencer. For a fighter-sized aircraft, it has an unusually long range. The Myshashev M55 Geophysica is the Russian equivalent of the Lockheed U-2 spy plane, except this one is unlikely ever to have been used for military spying. It was originally conceived in the 1950s as a high-altitude interceptor with a dorsal gun turret to shoot down American spy balloons. These were released in Germany and followed the trade winds over the Soviet Union to be recovered in the Pacific. The balloon flights finished before the aircraft flew, so the development slowed and it eventually flew in 1978 as the single-engined M17 dubbed Mystic by NATO. The twin-engined M55 Mystic B that we see here first flew in 1988 and set 15 world records for height, all of which still stand today. 4 were built, but it's believed that 3 were lost in accidents. Publicly, the remaining aircraft has been involved in high-altitude atmospheric monitoring, notably the ozone layer in the Antarctic, but the aircraft were most probably used for testing side-looking airborne radar at high altitude for battlefield surveillance. Standoff surveillance rather than overflight has only ever been the option for the M17 M55. As early as 1960, a U-2 was famously shot down over Russia, and the M55, operating at similar heights, around 70,000 feet, would be too vulnerable to modern fighters or anti-aircraft missiles. Recently, the Russian Ministry of Defence has ordered an upgraded version to be built from one of the 2 unfinished airframes at the Smolensk factory. India and Israel have both been talked about as possible customers for an ELINT, electronic intelligence version. Leading this mixed bag of helicopter types in service with the Russian Air Force is the giant MiL Mi-26, NATO codename Halo, by far the largest helicopter ever built. It can fly on one of its 2 engines and carry almost its own empty weight. It is widely used by the world's military and some civilian operators too. Accompanying it are 4 MiL Mi-8 HIP transport and assault helicopters, one of the world's most successful helicopters, with over 17,000 built, including the Mi-17 export version. Two Mi-35s follow them, the latest version of the Mi-24 Hind gunship, and bringing up the rear are 3 Karzan Ansat-U training helicopters. 40 are on order for the Air Force. This is the same formation running through from our airside camera and shown without narration. The telltale smoke gives away the arrival of 4 MiG-29 fighters, NATO codename Fulcrum. These aircraft are based at the nearby Kubinka training base and are demonstrating the aircraft's impressive dogfighting ability. The Soviet Air Force had around 600, and about 1,000 are currently operational around the world. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, around half of the MiG-29s remained with the successor states. Today, the Russian Air Force operates around 200. The West was fully able to evaluate the MiG-29A when Germany reunified and the Luftwaffe absorbed the MiG-29s from the former East Germany. In 1997, the United States purchased 21 later models from Moldova, partly for evaluation, but mainly to stop potential nuclear bombers going to rogue states, especially Iran. Most are thought to have been scrapped. As in the days of the MiG-15 and F-86 Sabre, all aircraft have strengths and weaknesses. The MiG-29 was found to be very capable in dogfights at subsonic speeds, and the helmet-mounted sight was especially praised. In the visual range, even without fly-by-wire, an experienced MiG-29 pilot would have a distinct advantage against the best of the West. With such a good basic airframe, there's been lots of scope over the years for development, such as longer-range missiles, electronic countermeasures, a naval version, and, in the OVT, fly-by-wire and thrust vectoring. The Lipetsk Combat Training Regiment presented a half-hour spectacle including the MiG-29C, the Su-27 SZM combat aircraft, a Sukhoi Su-34 solo demonstration, and the Russian Falcons, with formation routines by 4 Sukhoi Su-27 SZMs. The Lipetsk Aviation Centre, 250 miles south of Moscow, has a literal translation: 4th Centre Deployment and Retraining Pilots of the Air Force. It also trains in maintenance. One of the disused runways is used to store retired airframes, mainly for scrapping, but some find their way to the big museum on the site. Flying and aircraft maintenance began at Lipetsk as early as 1916, and the aviation school was opened in 1923. In addition to these MiG-29s, Lipetsk is also home to Su-24, Su-25, Su-27, Su-30, Su-34 and Yak-130 aircraft, and more recently to all 3 Russian aerobatic teams, the Russian Knights, the Swifts and the Russian Falcons. NATO may have dubbed the Sukhoi Su-34 fullback, suggesting this is a fighter, but it is very much a bomber with a range to suit and crew comforts like a toilet and a kitchen and flying without oxygen masks. The wide side-by-side seat arrangement even permits standing up or sleeping in the gap between the seats. This solo display is flown by the commander of the Lipetsk Aviation Centre, Major General Alexander Karchevsky. The original Su-27 aircraft with the Soviet Union's first fully operational fly-by-wire system had serious faults and suffered some fatal crashes. Radical redesign, however, delivered such a good combination of aerodynamics and load-carrying ability that it has spawned a variety of sometimes confusing developments. The prototype Su-34 was converted from a naval trainer, and when a photograph was released of it apparently on approach to an aircraft carrier, Western intelligence got it wrong. This is the only Russian aircraft that can carry all available munitions on its 10 hardpoints. For low-level attack, it has a new multi-mode phased array radar with terrain following and terrain avoidance. In the long tail boom, there is a defensive rearward radar that monitors enemy fighters and engages if necessary. "124 have been ordered for the Air Force. The name Russian Falcons is an unofficial one for the team. They were formed in 2006 at the Lipetsk training base with specially painted Su-27 SM aircraft. They have displayed widely around Russia and neighbouring countries. As a team, they are unusual in that they perform low-level dogfight manoeuvres as part of their routine. So far in this show, we've seen many Su-27 flanker developments, but the original airframe we see here has received midlife upgrades to maintain its world-beating standing. It was designed to counter the American F-15, and a modified prototype smashed 27 world records, taking many away from the F-15. The Su-27 has been a favourite with airshow audiences. One of the Su-27 trademark manoeuvres is the tail slide. Nearly 700 have been built to date, and around 300 are in service with the Russian Air Force. The others are with 10 or so foreign air arms, some inherited when the Soviet Union broke up. China has been a big customer, and they are now made there under licence. The political, economic and technical issues that led to this Yakovlev Yak-130 defied a successful outcome for the programme, but what we have now is another possible world beater. The post-Soviet economic realities and the reform of the Russian Air Force meant deep cutbacks in training. The ultimate replacement of the L-39 trainer was not a priority. On the other hand, military conflicts with former Soviet states showed a need for a counterinsurgency aircraft. Increasing sophistication with avionics and weapons systems also demanded a suitable training aircraft not just for the Russian Air Force, but worldwide. The biggest change to former Soviet thinking was to produce the aircraft jointly with a Western company, in this case Aermachia of Italy. The advantage being to share the costs and open a world market. The declared needs of the partners' customers kept changing though, and in particular Russia did not want to be reliant on the supply of key components from outside. In 1999 the partnership was dissolved, but it had delivered a common, cost-effective airframe with a long service life capable of accepting indigenous engines, avionics and weapons. In the event, the Russian Air Force has decided it does not need it for weapons delivery, but it has been successfully tested with all of their weapons weighing up to 500 kilograms. It can carry up to 3,000 kilograms on its 9 hardpoints. The highly integrated reprogrammable control system allows it to replicate the characteristics not just of Russia's 4th and 5th generation fighters, but also the F-15, F-16, Rafale, Typhoon, F-22 and F-35, making it highly desirable in the export market. Deliveries to the Russian Air Force began in 2009, and up to 200 are expected to be delivered. The Yak-130 will supply up to 80% of the entire pilot training programme, reducing the need to use two-seat combat aircraft. The mainstay of primary training is the Yak-52 operated by DOS AAF. It benefits from the flight characteristics of its aerobatic forerunner, the Yak-50. This is the aerobatic team from the First Flight Flying Club, the only team in Russia operating with the Yak-52 and Yak-54 flying together. The Yak-54 is the latest competition aerobatics offering from this famous manufacturer. Another example of out-of-sequence numbering, the Yak-54 was actually developed from the Yak-55 with an instructor cockpit added in the rear. Its astonishing strength includes a minus 7G capability. It is flown here by female pilot Irina Markova, who thinks women are better able to withstand G-forces. The Yak-52 is rugged and simple to maintain. Since the breakup of the Soviet Union, many of the 1800 built have been bought by Western pilots, and an upgraded version is still in production in Romania. The DOS-AAF has said that it needs new aircraft. With the economic slowdown, around half of their aircraft are grounded in need of repair. A new version of the Yak-52, the Yak-152, is under development, and with President Putin's announcement to build up the Air Force, this project is likely to go ahead. Young Russian boys and girls getting their first air experience on the Yak-52 could well, one day, be flying this. The Sukhoi PAK-FA is intended to replace the MiG-29 and Su-27. It is a fifth-generation stealth fighter intended to counter the American F-22. The YF-22 prototype first flew 22 years ago, so Russia's economic slowdown of the 90s has at least bought time for a proper assessment of need. For the time being, it is aircraft like the MiG-29M that fill the front line. This is the M2, the two-seat version. The original improvement of the MiG-29 was called the MiG-33, with the NATO name Fulcrum E, but reverted to MiG-29M and is sometimes called the Super Fulcrum. Just to add more confusion, there is now a MiG-35 with improved electronics and weapons system. In an attempt to build on its strengths as a short-range subsonic visual dogfighter, its multi-role capability has been improved with enhanced use of air-to-air and air-to-ground high-precision weapons. Its internal fuel capacity has also increased, permitting a considerable increased combat range. The M model now has four-fold redundant fly-by-wire and a better pilot-to-aircraft interface. With airframe changes, this is effectively a new aircraft. So, Has the brief for multifunctionality, manoeuvrability, low visibility and supersonic cruise been met in the PAK-FA? Whether or not it will deliver is much in debate in the new Open Russia, but if there is one thing that history has taught us about Russian aviation development, it has been clear in this programme. It is that there is something in the Russian psyche that drives them to overcome setbacks. The decimation of the officer corps in the 1930s, the near destruction of their air force and aircraft manufacturing industry in 1941, the unsuitability of Western Lend-Lease airframes in the Russian winter, the successful application of unsuitable and obsolete airframes to the demands of war, the aerodynamic can of worms of the original MiG-1 and Su-27, the economic and identity crisis that followed the breakup of the Soviet Union. No one can deny the Russian desire for national strength. They suffered terribly in the Great Patriotic War with approaching 25 million dead, more than half of them civilians. And this is the aircraft that will front that strength for the foreseeable future. One of the most remarkable things about the project to date is the relatively low cost of $10 billion, and it's still on schedule.
Итак, посадка самолета Т-50, вы можете наблюдать справа. Есть посадка, благодарим Сергея Богдана. Есть посадка.
As the show approaches its close, it seems appropriate to bring on the public face of any air force, the National Aerobatic Team. And here we have two. An immaculate Diamond 9 comprising 4 MiG-29s of the Swifts and 5 Su-27s of the Russian Knights. The first true aerobatic team in the Soviet Union was Red 5 in the 1930s with Polikarpov I-16s. Since 1952, the 234th Air Regiment, later becoming the 237th, formed a team around the frontline fighter of the day. Based at Kubinka, none had an official name and the number of appearances and display routine were limited. The two teams we see here were officially formed and named in 1991 at Kubinka. The Russian Knights fly the Su-27, and their first public appearance, to great acclamation, was in the UK in September 1991, following a goodwill visit to Russia by the Red Arrows. The Swift's first foreign display after formation was at a private Swedish Air Force show, but they did display to the public in France in 1992 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Normandy Neiman Squadron. They flew 50 displays in their first 2 years. The Swifts arrive with their trademark release of flares. As with the Russian Knights, the team makeup in terms of pilots and to some extent aircraft varies for operational reasons, so there is never time or resources to work up complex aerobatic routines. In 2003, an active cooperation with the Russian Knights began, and in 2007, the combined team of 9 aircraft performed a barrel roll. The height of the team's performance has been a 6-aircraft gear-down loop. The Russian Knights' activities have vacillated between success and tragedy. In 1995, 3 aircraft and 4 pilots were lost, flying into a mountainside when their lead IL-76 made a wrong turn. And in 2009, their leader, Colonel Igor Tkachenko, was killed after a mid-air collision during a practice display. 2 aircraft were lost, but 2 other pilots managed to eject safely. This was all the more tragic with it happening just before the biannual MAKS air show. Colonel Tkachenko was awarded the title of Hero of Russia posthumously by Russian presidential decree. The team was back to 5 and flying with the Swifts the following year under the command of Guards Colonel Igor Shpak. In the background to the celebrations for the Russian Air Force's 100th anniversary, there is continued speculation about the future of the 3 official display teams. For the moment, all 3 are based at Lipetsk, which apparently is not a completely happy cohabitation. There is talk too of equipping the team with Yak-130 trainers, not a positive prospect for some. All this speculation is only to be expected in a free society. Politics and aviation developments have always been intrinsically linked. That is what most of the history of the Russian Air Force is about. So, for the last minute or so, enjoy the sight of some of the best aircraft in the world being flown by the best pilots to celebrate some remarkable human achievements. we conclude with a brief compilation of the visiting air forces and aircraft operators that we have not had space to include. They do feature in depth in our parallel production, European Airshows 2012.
I really hope you've enjoyed this show from the PlanesTV archive. As I've said a couple of times, it's from our on-demand service, so that service is available at watch.planestv.com. But if you head to planestv.com/12 days, you'll find a route there to get half-price access to our service for the first 6 months. It gives access to nearly 300 full-length airshow programmes, live broadcast special features stretching back to the early 90s, some really good nostalgia. It has all of our programmes released over the last 10 years, hundreds of hours of aviation entertainment to while away the winter evenings. So that link again, planestv.com/12 days. I dare say I've popped it up on screen if I've done half my job right. And yeah, hopefully it's an enjoyable service that you can enjoy over the next 6 months. I hope you've enjoyed this show. Do like the Facebook page, subscribe over on YouTube, and if you've enjoyed the show, do give it a thumbs up, a share to people that might have enjoyed it, although it won't be available for much longer. This is just a live premiere of this full-length show that won't be available long term, so forgive us for that. But of course you can get on-demand access to all of our programmes released over the last 10 years, and very many released over the last 30 years over on watch.planestv.com. But use the link planestv.com/12 days to get your first 6 months on the service at half price. Thanks again. See you at an airshow soon. Cheerio.